Okay, so magandang araw po. Annyeonghaseyo. So welcome to the 8th Philippine Korean Studies Symposium. I am Tana from the Department of Political Science, University of the Philippines, Diliman, and I will be your moderator this morning. Today's public lecture, Becoming a Global Pivotal State, South Korea's Foreign Policy in the Indo-Pacific, is hosted by the University of the Philippines Korea Research Center, or UPKRC, and the Asia-Pacific Pathways to Progress. So just a short backgrounder, the UPKRC was launched on April 27, 2016, with the support of the Academy of Korean Studies, or AKS, Korean Studies Promotion Service, and aimed to provide Filipino scholars and researchers with opportunities to widen their interests in Korean studies. The center hopes to be a venue for students and professionals to produce meaningful comparative research and to promote collaborative partnerships among Korean and Philippine institutions. The center serves as a university-wide hub that helps promote and develop Korean studies in the university and in the country. It sponsors interdisciplinary and inter-college research and educational activities on Korean studies, as well as facilitates the training of the next generation of Koreanists in the country. And on the other hand, the Asia-Pacific Pathways to Progress is a think tank that seeks to promote the future-oriented, people-centered, peaceful, and independent Philippine foreign relations. So you can check their website at www.appfi.ph. So I think the UPKRC will now show a brief infomercial about the center. Okay, thank you. Yeah, so before we begin our program, we would like to remind our viewers of some house rules. You may send your questions and comments to our panelists throughout the event in the chat box. The questions and comments will be read during the open forum and will be addressed by our guest speakers. We are also reminded that the whole forum is a safe space, and we will not tolerate any form of bullying or trolling, academic or otherwise. The organizers reserve the right to remove those who will create disruption in any part of the program. And we would also like to inform you that this event will be recorded and uploaded to the official UPKRC YouTube channel. So now let me introduce today's speaker, Dr. Andrew Yo. Dr. Yo is a senior fellow and the SK Korea Foundation chair at the Brookings Institution Center for East Asia Policy Studies. He's also a professor of politics at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. And in addition to his most recent book, State, Society, and Markets in North Korea, he is also the author or co-editor of 4 other books: Asia's Regional Architecture, Alliances and Institutions in the Pacific Century, published in 2019, North Korean Human Rights, Activists and Networks, published in 2018, Activists, Alliances, and Anti-US based protests, published in 2011, and Living in an Age of Mistrust, an interdisciplinary study of declining trust in contemporary society and politics and how to get it back, published in 2017. Dr. Yo is currently working on a project that examines South Korea's role in the Indo-Pacific region and how South Korea can support a rules-based order outside its traditional focus on Northeast Asia. He's also conducting relations. His research applies Asia's regional architecture and institutional change, the U.S. grand strategy and force posture, and the role of narrative and discourse in international relations. You can read Dr. Yo's full bio at the Brookings website at www.brookings.edu. So Dr. Yo, Andrew, so you may now proceed with your presentation.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that kind introduction, Dr. Tana. And I also want to acknowledge the UP Korean Research Center and also Professor Kyungmin Bae for inviting me and helping it convene today's event. And I know we've been in discussion for quite some time about holding this, but because of my own travel schedule and end of year madness, it was hard to figure out a time, but it's something that I definitely wanted to do and commit to, just because I think Professor Bae has done so much for the center, and I'd really like to just give her whatever support, and also UP whatever support I can just from my end. So it's a real pleasure and honor to be able to speak to this group today. I also want to share some slides, so just bear with me as I get the slides up on the screen. Okay, so I believe there everyone can see the slides. So the topic for today, I wanted to talk about South Korea's foreign policy in the Indo-Pacific, in part because South Korea fairly recently just released their report. It was at the very end of December when South Korea's Yoon Suk-yeol government came up with a strategy. But I also wanted to say a little bit more about South Korea being a global pivotal state, because this has been the bumper sticker, I think, for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and for the Yoon government in trying to describe its role in international affairs as well as its foreign policy. So I'm going to actually begin, I know this is a very much a foreign policy, international relations topic, but I thought I would start with this image. I don't know if anyone is familiar with this drama. It's a scene from a drama called Descendants of the Sun in English. But some of you may be familiar with the actor because he was in the news, because apparently he got remarried. He was once married to his co-star, but they got divorced. But we're not here to talk about K-drama gossip. We're supposed to talk about foreign policy. But the reason why I put this slide up is because when you think about global pivotal state, just as a brief preview, the Yoon Suk-yeol government wants others to think about Korea as being very much engaged globally. Now, for those who are familiar with K-pop, K-dramas, and Korean culture otherwise, this may seem obvious. Well, yes, of course, Korea is global, but he means global and not just the soft power sense or in the economic sense, but as in the strategic sense as well, too, that he wants South Korea to really step up its game on the international stage. So I picked this slide for the scene because it's about South Korea being involved in a conflict, a reconstruction effort in a fictitious country called Urku, but I think it was actually very similar to Iraq. And in 2004, 2005, there were South Korean troops in Iraq taking part in reconstruction efforts. There was also a medical team, a unit that was out there as well too. But the idea is that South Korea wants to become more engaged or involved in the world. It wants to be on the global scene. But Korea, today it may seem somewhat obvious that Korea wants to become bigger and larger than just it's a very small country, but it wants to play a bigger role. That may seem obvious, but if we think about Korea just historically and geopolitically, the phrase or the mantra that's often been used is this notion of a shrimp among whales, and it just there's a saying in Korea, or a proverb that says when the whale, when the tail, when it splashes, all the shrimps get scattered or moved about. But the idea is that South Korea is a small country and it's surrounded by great powers all around and in all corners. And as you can see from the map, Korea sits in the middle, but you have China to the west, you have Russia in the north, you have Japan to the east, and then of course there's the United States, which is in some ways all over the place these days. But the idea is that South Korea is geostrategically vulnerable because of its position in Northeast Asia. And if you look at South Korea's history, especially its modern history, so modern being from the late 19th century to present, there are many times where South Korea, Korea, I should say, suffered because of great power politics. So in the late 19th century, as you know, there was a contest within the Far East for political influence and control. And some of the players were China, Japan, Russia, the United States, not so much at the time, but you'll know that Japan eventually colonized South Korea. And so again, it was at the hands of great power politics that Korea succumbed to Japanese colonization. During the Cold War, after independence in 1945, or after gaining independence from Japan at the end of World War II, the Koreans assumed that they would be in control of their own future, their own political destiny. But of course, the peninsula was divided because of, again, Cold War, great power politics and the Cold War, this time between the Soviet Union and the United States. And in 1953, you had the Korean War when North Korea invaded South Korea. So once again, they suffered at the hands of these larger geopolitical forces. And so then afterwards, they allied, they created the US-South Korea alliance in 1953. They signed a mutual defense treaty. And we're now celebrating this year the 70th anniversary of that alliance. But it's the idea that South Korea was heavily reliant on the United States for security and protection. And if we fast forward, from the Cold War to the post-Cold War period and the 21st century, South Korea is still vulnerable in many ways, like other countries in Southeast Asia, to US-China competition. But in some ways, I think Korea's the sense of this tension between the US and China is more acute because of the close alliance relationship that Korea has to the United States, but then also the fact that China is its largest economic partner, and geographically, China borders the Korean peninsula. And so in a unified Korea situation, China is going to have a lot of influence. So the point again is that we think about Korea maybe as having become more of a global state, and that's certainly the aspiration of this current South Korean president. He wants Korea to pivot to be much more engaged with the rest of the world. But I think historically, the sense of Korea has been that it's actually a small country and we're strategically vulnerable. And so you'll still see that coming up even today, elements of that narrative. And so if I were to just show, kind of diagram this tension. So this is from a friend, a colleague of mine, Scott Snyder. I think it's probably the best book on South Korean foreign policy. Came out in 2018. But you can see that there's this tension that South Korea feels in its strategic choices. So it's between alliance on one hand. So they want to be a faithful alliance partner with the US, but there are times where they want to have more autonomy, that they want to have a more independent foreign policy. Now, this may sound very familiar to the crowd there because the Philippines is the same way as well too. The Philippines is has a very close alliance relationship to the US, but at times, the Philippines wants to exercise autonomy. It wants to maintain its sovereignty, and we have no further to look than the whole issue of basing in the Philippines when South Koreans essentially gave the Americans the boot in 1991, but it seems like the Americans are returning, at least partially. But so Filipinos will certainly understand also this tension between alliance and autonomy on one dimension. But then the other dimension is about being more inward looking, so being parochial. Should we be focused on domestic affairs, or should South Korea be focused more on inter-Korea relations and dealing with North Korea, or should we be much more outward oriented? Should South Korea be much more international? So based on these two dimensions, you'll have different type of different type of foreign policy. And so right now, the President Yoon, the current South Korean government, has really placed his bets on this alliance-enabled internationalism. And that's really what the global pivotal state is, to answer my own question about what is a global pivotal state. And I'll say more about it in a few minutes, but that's in contrast to the previous President Moon Jae-in, who it was argued that he was much more engaged with inter-Korea affairs and engagement with North Korea. And also it's just the nature of his party, the Progressive Party in South Korea, has also tended to value, I think, its autonomy more than perhaps the Conservative Party. So I want to be careful in this because the Progressive Party, many progressives also support the US alliance, but even while supporting the alliance, they also want to have greater independence. So there's that's in contrast to the conservatives who are pretty much all in with the United States. And in the Q&A, I'm happy to talk about why you have those different outlooks between the main progressive and conservative parties. But that's the shift we're experiencing right now in the first year of the Yoon government. After 5 years of progressive government, South Korea has gone back to conservative rule. And so we're seeing this shift in South Korea foreign policy. So let me just speak a little bit more about this transition from the Moon government to the Yoon government in foreign policy. And I'm emphasizing this, or in some ways this is review for some of you because Philippines is in Southeast Asia, and the Moon government had a particular love or attention for ASEAN and really stepping up its engagement with ASEAN and also India in what was referred to as the new Southern policy. And I also want to give a shout out to our discussant, Dr. Jaehyun Lee, who's written quite a bit about the New Southern policy. He's probably the foremost expert on this topic. But just to recap what this New Southern policy was, it talked about these three pillars: people, prosperity, and peace, the three P's. And to be upfront, it was an emphasis really on prosperity and people, and not as much on the peace dimension. So there was a lot of discussion about trade, about development finance. The Moon government was very keen in promoting ASEAN smart cities, looking at green growth, technology. These are issues that South Korea has a comparative advantage in and can work together with ASEAN countries to develop smart cities. Human development, human capital, and also cultural exchanges. So this was the New Southern policy, and there is an orientation to really make Southeast Asia and South Asia more relevant in Korea's foreign policy. And part of it had to do with the need to diversify economically. And so even in the Moon government, they were quite cautious in how they approached China. From Washington's perspective, maybe too cautious, but they also understood that China was becoming more assertive, that they were willing to wield their economic leverage against other countries. So we hear a lot about economic coercion, and South Korea was one of the early countries to confront Chinese economic coercion because they supported a missile defense system from the US on their territory. So there's an economic boycott against Chinese economic boycott against South Korea. And South Korea felt that pain. So they recognized that, we can't just invest in China or rely on the Chinese market, but we have to look elsewhere. And elsewhere meant turning towards Southeast Asia. So Korea's largest trading partner is actually Vietnam these days. But beyond Vietnam, they're looking for other they felt that there was other potential within different Southeast Asian countries. So some of you may be familiar with this slide, because I also remember that I joined in on this conversation on the New Southern Policy Plus. So there was the NSP, but then there was a updating, a revised version of the NSP known as the NSP Plus, and the UP Korean Research Center actually did a webinar on this that I joined in and found was quite informative. But despite the NSP, and I think in ASEAN, among ASEAN countries, that it was very well received, especially because the Moon government was going to give much more attention and perhaps resources to ASEAN. There was some criticism over time, and so I'll just lay out what some of those critiques were. I don't necessarily agree with all of them, but this was what the feedback was after towards the end of the Moon government on the NSP. So one was that it avoided security and strategic issues. And actually, I still remember asking a question with one of the speakers on about that point, about why or whether the NSP would have more of a strategic, if it would have more strategic heft behind it. And his response was, the NSP stands for New Southern Policy, not New Strategic Policy. So I think he was very clear that the Moon government didn't want the NSP to be necessarily a security and defense framework. So the emphasis was still on people and prosperity. And the Moon government also, I mean, some critics also said that the Moon government didn't really do that much on the trade front. So you're supposed to boost ASEAN ROK trade, but it actually didn't go up that much. Now, in fairness, it was during the pandemic and the lockdown, so it's really hard to judge what the impact of the NSP was. Or in some ways, it's not really fair to judge it because you had the pandemic. But the real test would be, would there be an uptick in ASEAN-Korea trade that represents would the increase in ASEAN ROK trade reflect the decrease in China ROK trade? But I haven't looked at the statistics recently or what it's like these days. It's hard to tell because of now all these export controls and different policies that are coming into place. But the main idea is that it didn't really do all that much for South Korea's economy. Another critique, this isn't so much at the NSP, but it was more about the Moon foreign policy generally, was that he was too focused on the inter-Korea relations, so he couldn't give as much attention to other issues outside of the Korean Peninsula. And then the last critique, and this is really one that you heard in Washington and among the Trump and then later the Biden administrations, but it was the thought or the feeling that South Korea was becoming less relevant and less engaged in the regional security architecture. That is, there was these new multilateral institutions that were developing, such as the Quad. You had the Australia, UK, US submarine deal, the nuclear submarine deals, the AUKUS agreement. You had things like the CPTPP, comprehensive progressive trade. Goodness, I lost the acronym. The Trans-Pacific Partnership. That's right. So the CPTPP. So South Korea, I think, was interested at the end of the Moon government, and they were going to put a bid in. But the idea was that Korea was not so engaged with the changing Indo-Pacific security architecture, and that was something that the United States was noting, that Korea has a solid bilateral alliance with the United States, but it wasn't really engaged on the multilateral front. Okay, so this is when where we get to the transition from the Moon to the Yoon government. So there was an election in 2022. So elections were held in May 2022, and it was a very close race. I think Yoon won by just the smallest, the narrowest of margins. It was also an ugly campaign. Like other places around the world, politics in Korea has become much more polarized. But from the campaign period, then candidate Yoon, really staked out South Korea's foreign policy, or he staked out the U.S. alliance, and he really emphasized, making the U.S. the centerpiece of South Korea's foreign policy, but transforming it to a global pivotal state. And so in a piece published in Foreign Affairs magazine, so it's one of the leading magazines for anyone who follows foreign affairs, international affairs, he wrote that the GPS advances freedom, peace, and prosperity through liberal democratic values and substantial cooperation. So what is key here is this notion of freedom, of democratic values, cooperation. And if you hear that language, it very much resonates with the US Indo-Pacific strategy and everything that the United States stands for. So these are buzzwords that we hear from the United States: a rules-based international order, or a liberal order, democracy, freedom. And the Yoon government was adopting that language. It was very clear that he wanted to gravitate his foreign policy to that of the US and also other Western countries. So the global pivotal state reflected a rules-based international order. It was about values-based diplomacy, something that the Biden administration had also said repeatedly, meaning that issues like human rights and democracy would be a core part of South Korea's foreign policy. And he talked a lot about global engagement, global cooperation. And so it begins with the US-South Korea alliance, but just to check off in his first year what other things South Korea engaged in. So they attended the NATO summit with a few other Asian countries, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, now in Korea referred to as the AP4, but they joined the NATO summit for the first time. They have followed the Ukraine issue. They've been providing non-lethal assistance, pledged also funding for reconstruction. There's some discussion these days of whether South Korea may provide more military support, whether directly or indirectly, by continuing to sell arms to the Central European countries. When it comes to Northeast Asia, the Yoon government was very keen in mending fences with Japan, improving bilateral ties with Tokyo. And in addition, they really wanted to boost trilateral relations with South Korea, between South Korea, Japan, and the United States. And so that has also come to pass as well, too. There was a very strong statement in Cambodia on the sidelines of the East Asia Summit, where the three countries did pledge to strengthen trilateral cooperation, not just in Northeast Asia or in response to North Korean threats, but really a trilateral for the Indo-Pacific. In fact, that's what it was referred to, the trilateral statement on the Indo-Pacific. And more recently, South Korea pledged to help co-host the Biden administration Summit for Democracy, hosting one of the agenda topics. I think Korea will lead the agenda on anti-corruption, but they're also trying to be one of the advocates for Biden Summit for Democracy in Asia. So these are all ways where South Korea has engaged the globe, where the UN, and it's all part of this idea of South Korea becoming a global pivotal state. Now, there's a lot of discussion about, why mention global pivotal state when South Korea is already global. A previous president and the late 2000s, early 2010s, Lee Myung-bak, he had also coined the term global Korea. But the idea, the difference here is this term pivotal. So it has two meanings according to the foreign minister. One is that it's a pivot or a shift from looking at more issues that are more insular, looking away from just the North Korea issue and trying to engage the rest of the world. So it's moving from inward to an outward orientation. But then the second meaning is that South Korea really is an important player on the global stage. And that's the statement that that the foreign minister wanted to make about global pivotal state. And so that's where we have South Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy. And actually, I'm going to jump to this slide. So one of the pledges that the Yoon government made after becoming elected is that South Korea was going to develop its own Indo-Pacific strategy. And so one of the critiques that the Yoon government had about his predecessor was that they shied away from an Indo-Pacific strategy. They didn't want to use, the Moon government didn't want to have an Indo-Pacific strategy because it was seen as an anti-China type strategy. So the term Indo-Pacific, it comes from Japan, Australia, the US. And because of that aversion that China has, we don't want to aggravate China. So we won't have an Indo-Pacific strategy. We'll have the New Southern Policy, which is very inclusive sounding, and it focuses just on ASEAN. And it came to a point, though, when other countries are developing an Indo-Pacific strategy, and you're a US ally and you have none. And so I think the Yoon government felt that there was a glaring hole or a gap in not having its own Indo-Pacific strategy. And so they worked furiously to try to come out with the strategy as quickly as possible in 2022. And I know Dr. Lee has some thoughts on this, of whether it was too quick, developed too quickly or not. But I think part of the reason why they were hasty in coming out with the strategy is because there was expectations that South Korea would come up with one, and that it should if it's a US alliance partner. Frankly, it looks a little weird when there are countries like the Czech Republic or the Netherlands that come out with an Indo-Pacific strategy, and they're not even in the Indo-Pacific, but a US ally like South Korea has yet to come up with one. So I think there is some pressure felt in that on that front from the Yoon government. So if you look at the actual strategy itself, so I've looked over it carefully a few times, but it's interesting to note that if you look at the structure, this is basically the table of contents here that I have on this slide, but it starts with the background. But the very beginning begins with the economic significance of, it says strategic significance on the slide. So this is from the actual strategy, this figure that's on the slide. But you'll notice that they talk about the population, first the Indo-Pacific population, the GDP, 62% of the world's GDP, 46% of trade, half of all global transport flows through this region. But for Korea, you can see how heavily it relies on this region in terms of exports and imports, in terms of its trade, foreign direct investment. So the idea is that this region is so significant to South Korea that you have to also make this region a part of your foreign policy strategy. So it's the economic significance that's tied to the strategic rationale of the Yoon government's Indo-Pacific strategy. So that's the background or the premise that the Yoon government has for wanting to come up with an Indo-Pacific strategy. But in terms of its vision, they talk about a free, peaceful, and prosperous Indo-Pacific. So they want to see this region become free, peaceful, and prosperous. And to do that, South Korea will follow these principles of cooperation. So they mention inclusiveness, trust, and reciprocity. And I want to emphasize inclusiveness because I think this is one of this term itself led to many debates, and I was involved in some conversations with Korean experts who were helping consult the Yoon government in drafting the strategy. But inclusiveness in some ways a code word for let's not confront China too hard. And so one thing you'll notice about the Indo-Pacific strategy is they don't talk about outcompeting China like the US national security strategy. They don't talk about China being a rival or a bad actor. So they're very careful in the way to describe China. In fact, they say that China is a partner and that they want to have mutual reciprocal relations with China. So very different on that front from, I think, the US, in that they don't want to confront China too hard. But they want to follow these principles of inclusiveness, trust, and reciprocity. So on that front, it actually sounds a lot more like the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, because ASEAN is also very big on inclusiveness. And then finally, if you look at the section on regional scope, so this is a part where there was a little bit of head scratching for me, because it's the Indo-Pacific strategy, but they literally have every region mentioned in there except for the Arctic. They talk about the Middle East, about Africa, Latin America, and I guess Africa and Latin America. Africa, parts of northeastern Africa could be construed as part of the Indian Ocean, and then Latin America on its western coast is part of the Pacific Ocean. But they do mention Africa and Latin America and also Europe. Because Europe is also very much heavily invested in this region too, and it's a way for Korea to then partner with Europe on the Indo-Pacific. So that's the strategy in a nutshell. But if you look at what it actually entails, they list 9 different nine different goals that they want to pursue. And I'm not going to go over all of this. You can look at the slide, but some of the key points that I'll make is there's issues about the values-based diplomacy, like norms and rules, or the rule of law and human rights. There's security issues involved, so it's not like the NSP, where they don't mention issues like non-proliferation or counterterrorism, but those are in there front and center. They talk about threats from North Korea, from China. They talk about non-traditional security issues as well too. Economic security and comprehensive security. And they'll talk about technology, climate change, and energy. These are all issues that I think are very critical to South Korea and its future, and an area where I think South Korea wants to play a leading role. And also development cooperation. And this final part about promoting mutual understanding and exchanges. So this is where you get into the soft power and the K-pop culture, K-dramas, language study. So in some ways, the Korean Research Center, that they also fall under the Indo-Pacific strategy, and that is a way of fostering South Korean language and culture and history, and promoting mutual understanding. So that's the Indo-Pacific strategy, but it doesn't mean that there aren't problems with this. And I know we can get into this more from the reactors, comments from Dr. Lee, and in the Q&A. But some of the challenges that I want to pick up on, the first, and I think the biggest one, is really balancing this idea of inclusivity with what the Yoon government also refers to as forming ties and cooperating with like-minded countries. Like-minded countries is actually code word for US allies and partners to confront China. And so it's really about managing China-US rivalry or US-China competition. And even though the Yoon government has really doubled down on the US-South Korea alliance and has drafted its Indo-Pacific strategy in the likeness or in the image of the US Indo-Pacific strategy, I don't think it's going to just jump on board and be all in with the US when it comes to competing or trying to outcompete China or slow down its growth, because I think Korea is in a different place economically, but also, as we mentioned, geostrategically. And so that's something that I think will have to be sorted out in the current South Korean government's foreign policy. In the same vein, I think Korea will have to be able to manage both inter-Korea issues while also pursuing this global engagement. What happens if North Korea launches a 7th nuclear test? A lot of energy, resources, and time will have to then be spent, trying to address North Korea's nuclear program. And even past fall, we had a record number of North Korean missile tests. There's an increase, heightened sense of tension and fear regarding North Korea. But that can't just be completely ignored. So can you have this global pivotal state? Does it make sense to talk about Ukraine or provide lots of aid to the Ukrainians, or does it make sense to pursue policies in places like Africa or Latin America when there's really pressing issues right next door, right across the border with South Korea? So that's something that the UN government will have to navigate. I also think issues about economic security and supply chains are going to be important, mainly because it's unclear it is clear on one hand what the US wants to do. They want to really kneecap China and prevent any of its allies or partners from also giving assistance or technology to China. And so because of that, South Korea is going to have to make some hard choices. Are they going to follow suit what what the Biden administration wants to do? Or will they want some independence? Will they want to continue to rely on production facilities and global value chains that go through China? So that's something that I think the UN government will also have to think about. Also, the idea of values-based diplomacy. So this sounds great, human rights and democracy, but some South Koreans feel, is this the place for South Korea to be, talking about democracy? So how hard should South Korea promote democracy abroad? It's one thing for a great power like the US to do it, but should South Korea be on the leading edge or the leading front of this? And especially on issues related to China, like the treatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang, or the restriction of freedoms in Hong Kong. Is that something that South Korea really needs to weigh in on when there may be larger diplomatic costs? And then lastly, there's also domestic political challenges. I think a key point to make here is that it's a period of divided government where the National Assembly, the legislative branch, is controlled by the opposition. So even if the UN government wants to be all gung-ho about having much more global engagement in terms of the budget, where's the money going to come from? And is this something the opposition is going to support? And so on an issue like Korea-Japan relations, the UN government really wants to get past some of the existing tensions related to a court ruling case. I can say more about this on the Q&A, but it was passed under the Moon government. But is it something that the UN government can just sweep under the rug? Probably not, because the opposition is watching, and they're going to make it very difficult for the UN government to proceed. So there are some challenges on the horizon. The Indo-Pacific strategy for South Korea was just released 1 month ago, but now it's time to implement the strategy. The foreign minister of South Korea is right now in Washington. He'll meet his counterpart, Secretary of State Antony Blinken tomorrow. I'm sure they're going to talk about some of these issues. But we'll see if South Korea can really shift to become a global pivotal state. So we began, of course, with pop culture, and we'll end with pop culture. So I didn't realize that Blackpink is performing in March, for those of you who are K-pop fans. But I think what the Yoon government would like to do is it's not that it doesn't, it's of course wants to maximize Korean culture as much as it can on the global front, but it wants the rest of the world to not only think about Blackpink and BTS, but it wants the rest of the world to also think about Korea as a global pivotal state, that it's also a very important player on the strategic and defense front, as well as the economic and cultural front. So that's the transformation I think South Korea is trying to make under this current government. And maybe they're already halfway there, perhaps. So I'll actually conclude with this slide. For those of you that are BTS fans, you know that Jin, one of the members, had to actually go to the army. So, and I have here, Jin goes to the real army, but he's serving in the South Korean military right now. So, so again, maybe they're halfway there already. But I'll stop there. I look forward to any reactions from Dr. Lee and also questions from the audience. Thanks so much.
Okay, so thank you very much, Dr. Yo. So that was a very interesting and informative discussion on South Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy. Now, to share some more insights on the topic, we are honored to have Dr. Jae-hyun Lee as our reactor this morning. Dr. Lee is a research fellow and director of the Center for ASEAN and Oceania Studies at the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. Prior to joining the Asan Institute, Dr. Lee was a research fellow at the Korean Institute of Southeast Asian Studies and a visiting professor at the Institute of Foreign Affairs and National Security at the Korean National Diplomatic Academy. He writes extensively on international relations in Southeast Asia, ASEAN, and regional cooperation in East Asia. His research interests include Southeast Asian politics and international relations, regional cooperation in East Asia, and non-traditional and human security issues in general. He is the author of multiple articles, and his most recent publication is Transnational Natural Disasters and Environmental Issues in East Asia, Current Situation and the Way Forward in the Perspective of Regional Cooperation. He received a BA and an MA in Political Science from Yonsei University and a PhD in Politics from Murdoch University in Australia. So Dr. Lee, please.
Thank you so much. It's my honor to be a part of this program, and it's very good to catch up with you, Andrew, and Kyungmin, and the Philippine colleagues. It's always really good to be back in the program provided by University of Philippines Korea Research Center. And the first impression I got from the Andrew's presentation this morning or tonight is that the room for Korean experts is getting narrower and narrower and narrower. Because the many people outside Korea is looking at South Korea's foreign policy, culture, society, and they have more in-depth knowledge than the Korean expert have. So my room to maneuver is getting narrower and narrower. So as you noticed, the Andrew's presentation this morning is such thorough and in-depth. I believe he knows more than I do about the Korean foreign policy, NSP and Indo-Pacific strategy, as well as domestic politics. And I don't really know about the Blackpink and BTS and all that, So anyway, it's a bit unfair for me to react to this sort of presentation. I mean, Originally I prepared a few points as my reaction to his presentation, but in the course of his presentation, I got some new ideas, and let me start with some real reaction to his presentation. And the first point I would like to make is South Korea's pivotal role in the global stage when it comes to the strategic issues. And as you saw, the Andrew provided a good map and the Korea's past history, how South Korea is squeezed, not between, but among big powers surrounding Korean Peninsula. And today, South Korean people and the government are very proud of what South Korea achieved economically and socio-culturally. South Korea made the development in such a short time span. The thing is, South Korean people and the government and the whole community is not quite confident yet that South Korea can project its power to the regional and global stage. As you know, the South Korean economy and the military power and social cultural power is big, but the mindset is still, it really takes time to develop that kind of middle power or great power mindset. So there's a big gap. I mean, if you look at the people who make foreign policy decision in South Korea, they are like in the late 50s or early 60s, even mid 60s. And they were mainly socialized when South Korea was a developing country. They spent their 20s and early 30s when South Korea was still developing countries. Of course, they know the current situation of South Korea in terms of economic, military, and socio-cultural capacity, but their mindset is not developed up to that level, if you know what I mean. So they are not quite confident yet that can we project our power to the region and global stage. Many people outside South Korea say that it's time for South Korea to come out and speak up for the international order, regional order, human rights, democracies. But there's some kind of reservation among Korean people. Can we do that? Are we big enough to do that kind of role? So within such a short period of development, Korea has not quite developed that kind of middle power mindset. The second point I would like to make is that the Andrew point at the quoting Scott Snyder's diagram. I mean, that really well describes the transition from Moon government to Yoon government. If you look at the Korean community regarding the foreign policy, there are only a small pocket of people who are loyal to parochial view at the moment. Parochial, if you still remember the diagram, there are dimension where this parochial mindset and US alliance meet. Then I would like to say that the street far right people are in that dimension. And on the other side, there is parochial and the autonomy kind of dimension. Of course, still there are kind of old left people put in there, and you cannot find that many people on this parochial side, and the today more and more people are on the internationalization side. Only difference, as Andrew mentioned, is with the US alliance. or South Korea's autonomy? If you ask that question to me, I would like to say that I'm more internationalization and autonomy side rather than internationalization, the US alliance side. Anyway, that transition from moon and from moon to Yoon, you described the transition very well. The another point I would like to react to your presentation is about New Southern policy. There is kind of a misunderstanding regarding the policy intention of a New Southern policy. I mean, if you look at the consequence of a New Southern policy, the more emphasis has given to economic cooperation and social-cultural cooperation. That's true. But it is not fair to say that the Moon government forgot about political security cooperation. From the beginning, that political security cooperation pillar has been in place, and government made some effort toward that front. You have to remember this two kind of obstacle or limits that every single South Korean government has. The first technical issue is more administration, bureaucratic and technical issue. Political security cooperation is good. Basically, it's good. But as a government officer or Ministry of Foreign Affairs officer who is in charge of pushing strategic defense and security cooperation forward, it's not that easy with Southeast Asian countries or other countries. I mean, the US-Korea military alliance has been in place more than 70 years. And if you are in charge of pushing the US-Korea military alliance, it's rather easy. But this one, security cooperation with Southeast Asian countries, with Australia, with India, with European countries, that's kind of a new territory. It's always difficult to open up these new territories within 2 years or within 3 years, or you are in that position. It's not easy to show the consequence and clear the tangible result of political security cooperation. So every single government officers, Ministry of Foreign Affairs officers, the security and defense cooperation, it sounds good, but not today. We can do it tomorrow, next week, next month, next year. On the other hand, economic and social cultural cooperation, you can show the consequence and result or your performance through the numbers. Hey, this much increase of trade, this much increase of investment, this much increase of people-to-people exchange. As far as the government officer is concerned, that's easier. That's easier. And as if you look at the natures of economic and social cultural cooperation, it's not government job really. It's private sector that promotes and pushes these cooperation ahead. It's private companies, it's private associations, it's individuals who really pushes this cooperation forward, not the government. That's one point I would like to emphasize on the NSP's negligence of peace and security cooperation. So there's kind of, what I mean is there's kind of, structural limit. Regarding the Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy and pivotal state policy, well, Andrew has covered the both dark side and bright side of the policy very well, so I don't have much to add. But the question is, domestic politics within South Korea, do we have the clear consensus on which way to go as far as the Indo-Pacific strategy is concerned. As Andrew mentioned, the Yoon Suk-yeol government won the election with really narrow margin, 0.7% margin. So the South Korean society is kind of divided on its perception on Yoon government. So it will be a really big burden for the Yoon government to promote Indo-Pacific strategy. That does not mean South Korean community, South Korean society as a whole is against liberal international order. That does not mean South Korean community is against universal norms, principles, and values. The big question is either South Korea with Indo-Pacific strategy, either South Korea goes towing the line with the United States or South Korea pursuing autonomy of South Korea in the region. So what I mean is that South Korea first have to have clear vision for the region based on South Korea's own national interest, based on South Korea's own assessment of the regional situation, based on the South Korea's preferred end state of the Indo-Pacific region. That kind of Korea's own vision, we have to first develop that kind of South Korea's own regional vision first, and then you have to develop Indo-Pacific strategy based on that, not just copying and pasting the other countries' Indo-Pacific strategy. So what I'm really worried about the Yoon Suk-yeol government Indo-Pacific strategy is that we are too much copying and pasting the other countries in the Pacific strategy. The last point I would like to make is South Korea's policy toward Southeast Asia or ASEAN under Yoon Suk-yeol administration. As you know, officially the NSP is over. And the Yoon Suk-yeol government came out with its own strategy, what I call Korea-ASEAN Solidarity Initiative. I believe the Ministry of Foreign Affairs guys are working hard on the details of this policy, and you will see more detail in the coming months regarding this KRC initiative. In the ASEAN Plus 3 Summit in November last year, the President Yoon Suk-yeol made a few comments on KRC, like increasing the Korea-ASEAN cooperation, the increasing amount of Korea-ASEAN cooperation fund, and South Korea will do more military exercise in the ASEAN region, and blah, blah, blah. And he put emphasis on security cooperation with Southeast Asian front. That sounds good, but I would like to see more details in the coming months. The clear difference between Moon Jae-in's New Southern policy and Yoon Suk-yeol's KRC is that the political will and political weight. If you look at Moon Jae-in's New Southern policy, it was presidential agenda. It carried such a big political will and strong political will and big political weight. The question is if KRC will get the same amount of political will and political weight. It's sad to say this, but the Korea's policy toward Southeast Asia is not one of the top priority of Korea's foreign policy. If it's not one of the top priority in South Korea's foreign policy, it definitely needs more political will and weight to push that policy ahead. Of course, there will be routine cooperation between Korea and Southeast Asian countries under Yoon government, but without political will, you won't see the same kind of progress that the NSP made under Moon Jae-in government. Well, there are a couple of more points that I prepared, but I already spent too much time, I believe. And if I have more chance to react later, I will talk more. And then I will stop here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Lee. So those are also very important points you have raised. And speaking on behalf of the audience, we have indeed learned a lot from your and Dr. Yo's discussions. It will be interesting really to see how South Korea will develop its Indo-Pacific strategy and middle power diplomacy in the near future. Now, this session is now open for questions and comments. To our audience, questions and comments may be posted on the chat box, and our speaker and reactor may address them and discuss them further. Or you can also use the raise hand function below in Zoom, and we will assist you so you can ask your question or questions directly to our speakers. Okay, so perhaps while waiting for people to ask their question, Mr. Levengood, so yeah. So please, you can unmute yourself and ask your question directly.
My name is Zach Lavengood. I'm from Charles University, and I'm currently I'm a PhD researcher currently at UP Manila from Charles University, and I'm conducting research on South Korean foreign policy in regards to the South China Sea dispute. And I'm wondering if either of you could comment on, say, how South Korean military sales are going to be affected sort of by this new foreign policy. South Korea, especially in the case of Southeast Asia, has been very big lately on selling, ships, submarines, jets, all sorts of different systems. So I'm hoping you could just comment on that for me.
Sure. Well, I want to say that the Yoon government would mention that South Korean arms are for sale. But this isn't just from the Yoon government. I think even under President Moon, first of all, it was within their own domestic defense expenditures. I mean, those had been going up annually on average 7% per year. But we were seeing military sales, but certainly the big focus has been on Central Europe. So Poland, $5.9 billion to sell them tanks, howitzers. Now there's discussions about fighter jets, maybe missiles, and the Czech Republic as well too. But in Southeast Asia, I do think that there will be an increase in sales as well too, not necessarily because of concern. I mean, partly because of South China Sea, but I think more generally, some of the Southeast Asian militaries need to upgrade their equipment. So there's been discussions of the Borame fighter jet. I think Malaysia, Indonesia are in the market for those naval vessels as well too. But I do think that there's going to be an increase in arms sales for Southeast Asia, in part because of South China Sea, but really because Koreans make good weapons that are relatively cheap. They're also interoperable with US weapons in some cases, and so it's a good. I think it's a good. Southeast Asian countries may see Korean weapons as a good investment. A bang for your buck, I guess I should say. Good investment based on the cost.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Yo. Dr. Lee, would you also like to respond to Zachary's question? Oh, I think Dr. Lee is muted.
Oh yeah, it works. I was not allowed to unmute myself. Andrew got good point there. At the moment, Southeast Asian countries, especially maritime Southeast Asian countries plus Vietnam, they want some defense industry cooperation with South Korea, and the South Korean defense, the assets, defense sales to Southeast Asia has got some merit, like what, as Andrew mentioned, is affordable, and there's the interoperability is guaranteed with the US, and plus it's we deliver quickly the military assets to the other countries. But as Andrew mentioned, it won't have a big impact on South China Sea dispute. The defense equipment that South Korea provides to Southeast Asian countries are just enough to elevate a little bit the Southeast Asian countries' capacity on the maritime domain awareness, and just to make surveillance on the close to their own territorial waters. It's not that big. It's not that high tech. It's not the high-end equipment. So, and the another important point regarding the arms sales to Southeast Asia is that there's a pros and cons within Southeast Asian community. Those pro opinion argues that it's good for South Korean economy, and South Korea has to do this kind of role for the regional countries, providing the military equipment. That's good for Korea. The cons say that, especially under Moon Jae-in government, you talk about peace, cooperation with Southeast Asian countries, but on the other hand, you provide the military equipment and arms to Southeast Asian countries. Does it make sense? There's that kind of comments from, especially from the civil society and NGOs within Korea. So there's a pros and cons regarding the arms sales in Korea.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Lee. Do you have a follow-up question, Mr. Levingood? That's it. Oh, please unmute Mr. Levingood.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I do have one more question. You spoke about sort of the broad range of this Indo-Pacific strategy, you know, how it touches basically everywhere in the world but the Arctic. And I'm wondering if that would perhaps lead to the strategy itself having too little of an impact, you know, going for this sort of shotgun effect rather than something that would be a little bit more piercing if it were more focused on, say, specifically certain areas of the Indo-Pacific rather than everywhere in the world but the Arctic itself.
That was one of my concerns when I first read it. You know, it becomes so watered down that what is the significance of this if you're talking about every region? It's supposed to be an Indo-Pacific strategy, but I do think that that was deliberate. And in fairness, there are actually many strategies that often begin very broad. If you remember when the US first came out with the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy under the Trump administration, it was more aspirational. It was, people said that, well, we need to see how this pans out, that it was put in very broad and sweeping terms. In the same way, I think when there's a first iteration of a strategy, it tends to be more broad and abstract. So I would say that also South Korea's strategy is a bit aspirational. But on the regional front, you know, it was a little bit puzzling why, you know, they mentioned every other region. And I have two explanations for this. One is because the foreign minister, he was the one that was really keen on this global pivotal state. I heard he was the one that had coined it. And so the Indo-Pacific strategy was also a way to be connected or signal the global, that global positioning of South Korea. And then the second is, at least I know for Africa, when I was talking with some of the individuals that were drafting the strategy, I do know that they wanted to talk about not only South Korea's development experience, but also its experience with democracy, its transition from the authoritarian period to democracy, and that they felt that that was something that they could share with countries and regimes that were autocratic perhaps or illiberal. And they pointed out specifically Africa. And so this would be North Africa. So I think they felt to connect the idea of democracy and freedom, that if they mentioned these other regions, that's something that they could pursue. So they were very deliberate in wanting to bring out that aspect of South Korea's history and legacy, the democracy part.
If I add a little bit on that point, I myself did not expect that such a broad kind of geographic definition of Korea's Indo-Pacific, and I was quite surprised that the government put West Africa in the Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy, and I think it's too much overstretch in a way. For example, if you look at the South Pacific Islands, we have 2+2 foreign and defense ministers meeting with Australia, and one of the top agenda has been the joint cooperation between Korea and Australia in the Pacific Islands area. And South Korea has been dragging its feet for many years. Do we have that kind of strategic and economic things in the South Pacific? Then, if that is the government's and Korean society's perception, then West Africa, what sort of economic and strategic stake we have in West Africa? Would it be supported by general publics in South Korea? I mean, I fully support that South Korean government to do more role in global stage. I would support that, but in reality, would it be supported by general Korean public? I have a big question mark on that. That's one point. And the other point is the, Andrew mentioned the democracy and human rights and principle values and things like that. It is really a difficult question as far as South Korea is concerned in its relation with the Southeast Asian countries. Some part of Korean community supports that, oh yeah, we have to promote democracy and human rights in Southeast Asia more. There are things going on, for example, in Myanmar. And some other people say that, oh yeah, if we put too much emphasis on these principal issues, human rights, democracies in Southeast Asia, it would undermine Korea's bilateral relation with those countries. So that's no. There are these competing views, and I don't know in which way the Yoon government would go. But I have a doubt that this government, despite its emphasis on human rights and democracy, I have a doubt that this government would actively promote this kind of value things in Southeast Asia without undermining bilateral relations. So if there's a demand from Southeast Asian countries regarding the human rights and democracies, we will respond. But otherwise, the government will be very careful about that.
Okay, thank you very much, both. We are receiving a lot of interesting, very good questions from the audience. So I will read one. So this is from Mr. Adrian Manalaysay. Will South Korea establish a regional collective security alliance with ASEAN and Japan similar to NATO? And I would also like to follow up on this since Japan is mentioned. Can South Korea work or cooperate strategically with Japan on Indo-Pacific issues given its own historical differences and territorial disputes with the latter? Oh. Sorry, can you please unmute? Yeah, there. Okay, so Dr. Yo, let me go ahead and then.
Sure. So in terms of strategic relations with ASEAN, I mean, it'll be difficult because ASEAN is quite cautious also on the strategic front. There isn't going to be any formation of a NATO type alliance in my opinion, within the Indo-Pacific. You have the Quad, and there was some discussion whether that would develop into a NATO-like alliance, but I think that won't be the case. But certainly with ASEAN, there's much more caution on ASEAN's front. I also want to mention what Dr. Lee had said about the Moon government and why the peace pillar, why there wasn't a strategic front, to a heavy strategic front. We have to also remember that that's not something that ASEAN is very keen on either. So you can't just blame it on Korea and say, well, how come there was no big strategic front on the NSP? Well, that's not what ASEAN was very interested in either. So they were probably more interested in the people and the prosperity pillars. And the question on Japan, we have seen an improvement in Korea-Japan relations, especially on responding to North Korean threats. So they hadn't conducted any joint exercises since 2017, but in the fall of last year, they conducted anti-submarine exercises. They conducted anti-ballistic missile joint exercises. They've agreed to share information on early warning kind of radar information in real time if there's any projectiles coming from North Korea. So this is all dramatic improvement considering where bilateral relations stood just a couple of years ago. And of course, trilateral relations I've mentioned have really warmed up. That being said, I still think there are limitations. Japan is moving very cautiously, much more slowly, I think, than Korea on bilateral relations. It has to do with the court ruling that I mentioned. So a South Korean court ruled that Japanese companies during World War II in the colonial area that had forced South Korean laborers to work have to be compensated by these companies. But the Japanese companies have said, we're not going to pay. Everything was resolved in 1965 when we normalized relations. And so the Korean government, the Yoon government, is trying to figure out a way to get past that. And the suggestion has been for a Korea foundation, not the Korea Foundation, but a foundation from the Korea side would contribute money to compensate victims. And the Yoon government is hoping if they do that, that maybe Japanese companies may voluntarily pitch in. But of course, Japanese companies say they can't force their companies to do it. But because of that hurdle right now, I think Japan is kind of waiting and seeing whether they'll move ahead further. So on the trilateral front, I think it is improving much more greatly. But on the bilateral front, I think they have to get past this hurdle for the two countries to move to the next level of security cooperation.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Lee?
Already Andrew mentioned the details of the fact between Korea and Japan, what's going on, and the Asian sort of NATO idea. And first, between Korea and Japan, the Yoon government's direction is quite clear to get the Korea-Japan relations back to pre-2000 something, getting it to build security cooperation again with Japan and all that. But I'm not quite sure. It's just the beginning, and there will be a big domestic political backlash. More than half, I believe, the Korean community is against what Yoon Suk-yeol government is doing toward Japan, and the Korean public's perception is like this. During the COVID-19 period, when there was trouble between Korea and Japan, the Japanese government introduced export ban on the chemical material, which were quite crucial to produce semiconductor in South Korea, and it was under Moon Jae-in government. And so the Moon Jae-in government was doing hard work to replace those Japanese exports to Korea. And at that time, South Korea was quite successful to replace those Japanese product. And so we believe that the table is turned. We got the ball is in our side, but under Yoon Suk-yeol government, the table turned again against South Korea. There will be definitely there will be some kind of backlash in South Korea regarding this Korea-Japan relations, regarding the Yoon Suk-yeol government direction. With Asian NATO, the Andrew pointed correctly that there could be some reservation among Southeast Asian countries if any regional or outside the regional countries trying to build this kind of Asian NATO. I mean, not against, but not quite support that kind of initiative. And I believe South Korea is pretty much the same. This is just my opinion, not the government opinion. We have recently we heard that there's increasing security and strategic cooperation between UK and Japan, and you have AUKUS and you have Quad and this Indo-Pacific. At some point, some of the experts in Southeast Asia and in Korea as well, were saying that the airing this kind of idea that the US, Japan, Australia, and India will be kind of a hub, security hub for this region, controlling the things. And the United States as a super hub is behind the Japan, Australia, and the India, and put regional countries, for example, Japan as in charge of Northeast Asia and some part of Southeast Asia, and Australia, Oceania, of course, and then some part of Southeast Asia, and India is in charge of South Asian region. And the regional countries, small and medium regional countries, put under that kind of pillars, sort of guided by Japan, Australia, and India. If anyone you seriously think about this Asian NATO kind of idea, then this kind of worries would re-emerge among the some regional experts. Is it a new sort of a modified hub and spoke system pursued by the United States?
Thank you very much. There are two questions from one of our viewers on YouTube, so I will read them both. Both refer to ASEAN. So the first one is, ASEAN operates in a consensus among the 10 members, not to mention that each ASEAN member state manifests values-based diplomacy and variation. How does South Korea deal with this conundrum in its Indo-Pacific agenda? So that's his or her first question. And then the second is, how useful is the ASEAN Plus or Dialogue Partners arrangement in the pivotal role of South Korea in the Indo-Pacific strategy? Could you discuss some examples? So you could either answer one or both. Okay,
Sure.
so Dr. Yo. Yeah.
I can take the first one. Maybe Jian, do you want to take the second one on the ASEAN Plus formats? But in terms of dealing with ASEAN and the 10 different countries, one thing I think that'll be different from the Yoon government with the Moon governments. I do think that the Moon government with the NSP was engaging with ASEAN. Of course, they had different bilateral relationships with each of the 10 ASEAN countries, but there seemed to be more of a focus on ASEAN itself as an organization, whereas I think with the Yoon government, what I've seen so far in this early stages is that he's developing he's working with ASEAN countries, or at least when it comes to Southeast Asia policy, it's more on a bilateral front, especially when it comes to security cooperation, because the 10 countries are all in different places in terms of how they feel about China, or some will be more focused on internal security than external security. So my assumption is that the current government will try to develop bilateral relations with countries that it makes, where it sees that there's an opportunity. But of course, in ASEAN, they'll find cooperation. There was a lot of discussion about the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, the AOIP. And so on that front, I think there are a lot of synergies, especially when it comes to promoting governance, capacity building in terms of development finance. So I think that's where the room for cooperation exists with ASEAN at the institutional level.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Lee?
Hey, Coach Andrew asked me to answer the second question, the ASEAN Plus thing. So the question is how useful is the ASEAN Plus arrangement in the pivotal role of South Korea? I believe it's a question about the ASEAN Plus One, ASEAN Plus Korea sort of a relation. How is important for South Korea to realize its global pivotal state or Indo-Pacific strategy. The question is that those people in the government who architect this Indo-Pacific strategy or global pivotal state strategy, how much do they understand Southeast Asia? How much do they understand the strategic value of Southeast Asian countries or ASEAN collectively? That is the main question. I mean, South Korea can utilize this ASEAN Plus arrangement very well, or South Korean government, Yoon government can just ignore this strategic value of Southeast Asian countries or ASEAN. It depends how much they understand the situation and the strategic value of Southeast Asia. And I personally believe the NSP was much better option as far as Southeast Asian countries is concerned than the Yoon government's Indo-Pacific strategy. But nevertheless, I have some reservation on the NSP. Initially, NSP was not just about Southeast Asia, but it also included India on the NSP umbrella. And after 5 years of pursuing NSP, India is largely forgotten. And as a specialist on Southeast Asia, I had a big question mark why the Moon Jae-in government put ASEAN and India in one basket, which proves that when the Moon Jae-in government first came out with NSP, they didn't have experts on Southeast Asia in shaping their policy. And I believe the situation in Yoon Suk-yeol government is worse than the Moon Jae-in government when it comes to their level of understanding of Southeast Asia. That's worrying development. I'll stop here.
They need to hire you, Dr. Lee.
Okay,
Not
thank
me,
you.
definitely not me.
So let us hear Dr. Asor's questions first before I read those in the chat. Okay, so please go ahead.
Thank you, Tay. Thank you, UP KRC and Professor Andrew Yo and Professor Lee for this wonderful presentation and discussion. My question is more theoretical and with, of course, impact at the more practical and ground level, me being a sociologist. This concept of middle power or global pivotal state means the ability to link between regional and international issues. And this is linked to Professor Lee's discussion just now about how much do they know, Southeast Asian nations or perhaps West African or North African societies, for example. So my question is, how does South Korea under the Yoon government would locate itself as a middle power or as a global pivotal state within the North-South relations and South-South relations? Because it seems like the discussion is more on very geopolitical, but the South-South relations would include, the three-piece under the Moon government. So I'm very curious as a sociologist, how it is locating itself within issues and discussions ideologically, practically, in terms of North-South relations and South-South relations. Thank you very much. It's been a wonderful discussion.
Thanks, Dr. Aso, and it's nice to meet you virtually. I wish we could have met in person when I was in Manila. But that's an excellent question, and it got me thinking. But there are really, I mean, I don't want to compartmentalize the Indo-Pacific strategy too much, but when it comes to working with those in the global South, and South Korea, tends to do this through the economic front, through investments, through the development, finance, and infrastructure. That's it takes us back to the NSP and what some of the goals there were. And when I mentioned ASEAN smart cities, or promoting good governance, anti-corruption, those were the ways that it tends to engage the South. But I think with the Yoon's foreign policy and this Indo-Pacific strategy, at the same time, they're trying to engage the North, or really the West, and on things like alliances. So when they say they want to be thought of as a like-minded partner within the Indo-Pacific, this is really Japan, Australia, and then allies in NATO who have also come up with their own Indo-Pacific strategies, like the UK and France. They want to be seen as, there's a G7 right now, but there's been some chatter about expanding the G7 format, and South Korea would love to be included in that group as well too. And so there are these two angles, and I think that's where the earlier question about whether the strategy is trying to do too much. Are you spreading yourself too thin, or does it begin to lose focus? I think that's where you can kind of see it. So in terms of its identity, and in terms of seeing itself as a middle power, that's where it may not yet be defined. And that gets back to Dr. Lee's point, where South Korea developed very rapidly. It was a small country, and so can it suddenly think of itself as playing on a big global stage? And I think it hasn't quite figured that out yet. But I think the Yoon government, if he has any kind of legacy or wants to leave one, it's helping Korea make that transition, or at least push Korea further in the direction of having Koreans think about themselves as being more of a global state, not a small parochial state.
Thank you.
Yeah, I fully agree with Andrew that the Yoon Suk-yeol government has its eyes on North rather than South, and I'm not quite sure if the Ministry of Foreign Affairs pivotal state strategy, does it have any elements on the North-South cooperation or South-South relation? I doubt that they have any idea on that. But on the other hand, the good news is the development cooperation, Korea's ODA to the region and global countries. It's been largely separated, or if you like, it has been autonomous from the foreign policy in many years. There were people saying that we have to strategically use our ODA to promote Korea's foreign policy. In some part, we do that. For example, our more than 30% of our total ODA goes to 6 Southeast Asian countries. That's a lot. And in that sense, Korea has used its ODA in very strategic way to promote Korea-Southeast Asia relations. But other than that, it's been quite separate from Korea's foreign policy strategy. It has its own kind of momentum and logic. So the Korea's ODA will grow further in the coming years. We are still far below the OECD average, and so it will grow. But the only danger I can expect is that what if the government pick its ODA allocation as a tool to bridge between, I mean, there was this kind of argument that South Korea has to be a bridge between the US and Southeast Asian countries who are adopting the kind of hedging strategy between US and China. And it is sort of, you know, bridge is to positive. What's really in their mind was kind of in South Korea as proxy of the US in approaching some Southeast Asian countries. I hope this does not happen, but if the government use this ODA resource to do that kind of, you know, job, that will be kind of disaster for Korean foreign policy and its relation with the Southeast Asian countries.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Asor, for the question. So we have 3 more questions, but only 15 more minutes left. Yeah, so unfortunately, you know, there are very interesting questions. So I'll just read the 3 questions, and then perhaps the speakers can answer whichever questions they would like to respond to. So the first is from Captain Diane Despi. The question for both speakers. So in the US Indo-Pacific strategy, it was mentioned that the ROK aims to promote regional security through capacity building. What is your opinion on how the ROK tries to operationalize its capacity building efforts with other countries, particularly within the Indo-Pacific region? More importantly, which particular capacities is the ROK actually most prepared or most willing to build with its partners, maybe particularly on security and economy? And then another question from Colonel Deliva. What is South Korea's policy cooperation when it comes to the use of renewable energy and veer away from traditional energy sources? And how is this contributory on energy transitions? And then the last one, so there are 2 actually. So it was mentioned in the lecture that South Korea is attempting to change the perception of people, particularly the international community, about the country from the usual K-culture perception to being a strategic partner in other aspects as well. How can South Korea shift these perceptions, considering that the Hallyu wave has been essential in boosting South Korea's middle power diplomacy? Another question would be, how would the shift from the Moon administration affect the bilateral relations of the Philippines and Korea, particularly in terms of labor migrants under the employment permit system? So in the interest of time, Dr.
A wide swath of questions. I'm not sure about the labor permit question. I don't know, Dr. Lee, if you have better insight on how there would be an impact there. So I'll punt on that one. But going in reverse on the renewable energies, I mean, one of the nice things is that the Yoon government has, I think, been fairly consistent with the Moon government in terms of meeting its climate change goals, reducing carbon emissions. In terms of renewable energy, South Korea is very keen in developing, you know, solar, wind, and if you look at its market, like things like electric vehicles, like they're much more on the road. They're going to keep developing more. I think South Korea is very serious about reducing carbon emissions. I do want to mention, though, that one key difference between the Yoon and the Moon government on energy policy is that they're very forward leaning on nuclear energy, and they've said that nuclear has to be a part of the equation on reaching its carbon climate emissions reductions goal. The Moon government wanted to phase out nuclear, but the Yoon government is going full throttle in promoting nuclear energy and selling nuclear reactors to other countries. They're very keen in that front. So that might be one difference, but yeah, I think renewable energies are very important to the current administration. on the culture and the transition from K-pop. So I want to say that it's not that K-pop is going to be downplayed or the cultural aspect is not going to be downplayed. These are real assets to South Korea, and any government will, or at least they should recognize that. But the argument I want to make is that in the past, when you thought about South Korea, the first thing that would come to mind would be the dramas and the K-pop, and then maybe like Samsung and other technologies, and that's great. But at a certain point, soft power can only get you so far in terms of having greater influence on the global stage. And so what South Korea wants is they want others to think about South Korea in other ways. And for the Yoon government, I really do think that they want other countries to see South Korea as more of a strategic player. And that's Dr. Lee's point about he thought that the Yoon government was really positioning itself towards engaging more with the global North than the global South. That it was more about joining the like-minded partners with the U.S. I do want to say that there still is an angle for the global South, but if it really is oriented towards if the strategy is oriented towards the U.S. and like-minded partners, the government wants the rest of the world to think about Korea beyond just its cultural products. And lastly, on the capacity building question, when the term capacity building is used, it tends not to be so much on the security front. It's usually more on the economic and things like governance, human capital. It's related to development finance, and oftentimes it's with technical capacity, because that's something that South Koreans can provide, especially based on its own experience with rapid economic development. But if you were to think more on the security front, what some areas would be like cyber. I know that South Korea, both the previous and the current government, is keen in cyber, satellites, global position. I don't know if they're using a GPS system, but Dr. Lee actually had worked on this issue. But those are some of the areas where they would provide capacity building, information systems, intelligence. That's where they could provide some input. Dr. Lee, I'm going to pass the baton over to you to see if you want to fill in anything that I may have missed.
Yeah, just briefly on each question, the capacity building. Andrew's got good point there. Cyber and ICT is something that South Korea can do for Southeast Asian countries, and also the maritime security issues that.
All right. Mm-hmm.
Navy, South Korean Navy is quite keen to expand its role in the region. I'm not quite sure if the Navy's intent can pass through the Ministry of Defense, which is dominated by the Army. But anyway, the Navy and the Maritime Police is quite keen to do its role in Southeast Asia and Indo-Pacific region to build regional countries' capacity. And the renewable energy, of course, the Moon Jae-in government as well as the Yoon Suk-yeol government put emphasis on sort of green cooperation, green economy, and it promises many projects with regional countries. But if you look at domestic front, actually the Yoon Suk-yeol government reduced budget allocation for renewable energy in South Korea and put more budget on the nuclear power plant. It's going the other way around. It's going reverse way. So I'm a bit worried about that kind of development domestically. If things goes wrong in domestic front, then its commitment in renewable energy or cooperation with other countries, I'm not quite sure how it can develop further. And the pay wave and transforming Korea's soft power into a sort of a strategic asset of South Korea. I've been getting this kind of question from my Southeast Asian friends for many years. Hey, you got such a big soft power in Southeast Asia. Why don't you transform or translate this into your strategic asset and in the region? I haven't found a way to transform soft power into the strategic power. The big question here is what South Korea can offer for regional countries strategically different from other countries can offer. The US can offer something strategically. Japan can do something. Australia can do something. India has its own direction. So how South Korea be different from those countries? That holds the key to the answer. South Korea has to be different from those powers surrounding Indo-Pacific region. If we offer something different from others, then it would enlarge South Korea's strategic weight and value. And I believe that's something that South Korea can transform its soft power into strategic power, or but we haven't. The quick answer is that we haven't found what South Korea's merit and what South Korea can offer for the regional countries different from other powers. I will stop here. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much both. So unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for this morning. So really very interesting discussion, and we received a lot of interesting questions. So for those who were not able to ask their questions, you may reach out to our speakers directly. So you may email them, or you could send your questions to KRC, and KRC will forward them to Dr. Yeo and Dr. Lee. Yeah, so unfortunately, yeah, no more time for the wrap up. So yeah, again, thank you very much everyone for your participation. So please don't forget to fill out the evaluation form. So the link will be shared later, and the participants will get a certificate. Yeah, so let's give a virtual round of applause to our speaker and reactor. Yeah, and with that, we formally conclude today's program. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. 수고하셨습니다. 감사합니다.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So we could